The gentleman from New Jersey reserves his time. The gentleman from Oklahoma.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield time to the gentleman from Virginia, Congressman Wolf, as much time as he may consume.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the gentleman and ask unanimous consent that I can revise and extend. I was watching this meeting and resolution in my office today, and I support it. I think it's a good issue, but I want to say to the gentleman from New Jersey, I don't understand why you've boxed up for months and years the bill that Congressman Chris Smith has that deals with Lyme disease. Now, I was at a national Lyme disease conference this week. Lyme disease is spreading through our nation. Lyme disease is spreading through my congressional district. Lyme disease is spreading through New Jersey, spreading through the gentleman's district, spreading through Mr. Smith's district. And if I could get the gentleman's attention rather than whispering back and forth, I would like to know if we're going to do resolutions like this and take them out of the committee, why Mr. Smith's bill, which has been pending in your committee for a long time, cannot be considered. If you watched the movie the other day, the number of people that have been impacted by Lyme disease is very serious. This is spreading. It's in Pennsylvania, I would tell the person who's chairing the House. It is spreading throughout the United States, and yet the bill is boxed up, locked up in your committee. And I want to know, because I've had enough of seeing this thing and seeing it go time after time after time, and you're keeping the bill from coming out. So if I could yield to the gentleman to tell me, what do you plan on doing about Lyme disease? Why won't you get that bill out? What is the status of it? And what would we tell somebody who happens to have Lyme disease today to know that the bill is pending in the committee? I yield to the gentleman.
Well, as I've discussed with the gentleman, because we have actually talked about this on several occasions, I believe, we are now doing what we call consent bills. In other words, bills that have the consent, meaning are basically agreed to not only by the Democrats and Republicans, but also by the members of the subcommittee and the members of the House in general, because, as you know, you have to have a two-thirds vote to pass these bills or do them by unanimous consent. We do not have anything near consensus on that legislation. It would have to go through regular order, have a hearing, go through subcommittee. The problem is that many, probably the majority, but I won't venture to say, whether it's a majority or minority, but many people do not agree with the protocol, if you will, that is suggested, if not mandated, by that legislation. In other words, right now, the majority of the doctors treat Lyme disease, in a certain fashion. Those who advocate for that legislation suggest a different protocol. And frankly, I have tried very hard as chairman of the Health Subcommittee not to mandate or make decisions for physicians as to what kind of protocols they use. In this case, the protocol is very different from the overwhelming majority of the doctors, and so it's a very controversial issue that needs to have a lot of debate. So there's absolutely no way that we could do something like that on a consent calendar, because many of the members simply don't support it.
Reclaiming my time, though, why hasn't the gentleman had hearings on it?
Well, we could certainly have hearings on it, and as I've discussed with the gentleman, I would like to have hearings not only on that bill, but on the issue of Lyme disease, research, and treatment, and we will certainly do that in the next session. But we're obviously not doing this today in the context of a consent calendar.
Reclaiming my time, I will take you at your word that you're going to have hearings. Is that accurate, early in the year?
What I said is that I would like to have hearings on the issue related to Lyme. We can certainly take up the issues that are raised in that legislation in the context of that. But as I would say to the gentleman again, the protocol in that legislation is very controversial. It's certainly one of the many things that we would have to consider in the context of research and treatment of Lyme disease.
Reclaiming my time, we're not going to let this issue go away. I want to tell the gentleman from New Jersey. even if I have to come up into New Jersey and go throughout to say that this bill is being boxed up. Just so members know, incidents of Lyme disease are rapidly rising in Virginia, in my congressional district, but across the country. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, from 1993 to 2007, reported cases of Lyme in Virginia have risen 909%, and this committee has done nothing. In the same time frame, reported cases are up 235% nationwide. Lyme disease is frightening. Picture Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts camping during summer months, or children playing in the backyard, or joggers on bike paths through tree-lined neighborhoods sharing the outdoors with a minute insect that can bring monumental health problems. The Congress needs to get serious. So I just wanted to, I was watching this, and I think you have boxed it up. You know, when the gentleman was speaking, I listened to him. If you could look at me, I would just appreciate it. I want to tell the gentleman that we're going to hold you to this with regard to hearings. I will come and testify. But if this issue is boxed up next year, we're going to deal with it in many ways. I would ask unanimously, you want to say something? I'll wait.
Well, I would just say this. You know, it does bother me because the gentleman is sort of suggesting that you and I haven't had conversations about this. We've actually had many conversations about this. I've told you the same thing I've just said here on the floor. And I really don't understand why, you know, the gentleman is giving the impression that somehow we haven't discussed this, because we have.
Reclaiming my time, I never said we've discussed it twice. What I'm saying is that you've boxed the bill up, you've boxed Christmas bill up,
Well,
you've had no hearings, and there are a lot of people around the country that are suffering with Lyme disease, and you appear to be the roadblock for some roadblock. And so what we're asking for is hearings next year, and give us an opportunity for people of all sides to be heard.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
First of all, I resent the fact that the gentleman has suggested that we've been boxing this up. I will point out to the gentleman that the problem of Lyme disease has been around for many years, and the gentleman and his committee, Appropriations Committee, were in the majority for what? At least 12 years before the last 2 years that the Democrats have been in the majority. Certainly the gentleman had plenty of opportunity, and still does, to do something about this himself.
Reclaiming my time. I was going to offer the Chris Smith Amendment to the Appropriations Bill. The Appropriations Bill hasn't met and had to have the hearings for months. Your side has prohibited any amendments being offered. But I would tell the gentleman, next year, if you don't move this bill, I am going to offer it to the Labor H bill next year, and we will have to deal with it on the floor.
Well, if the
I ask unanimously to yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I would consume. I would just point out, and on this and so many other issues, it is amazing to me that the gentleman who was in the majority for so many years and had so many opportunities to raise this and other issues is somehow now suggesting that the Democrats are boxing it up. You know,
yes.
Lyme has been around for a long time. The people concerned about this issue have been trying to address it for a long time. The bottom line is the gentleman knows this is a very controversial issue. We'll certainly raise it. But he had ample opportunity the many years that he was in the majority to raise it, and it just didn't happen. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yield me another minute.
Yes, how much time do I have?
New Jersey wants to yield back his time or reserve his time?
I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma has 8.5 minutes remaining.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give Mr. Wolf some more time to talk about as much as he may consume.
This is a growing issue. It is becoming a more important issue and a new issue. If you look at the statistics, it is growing around the nation. It is now becoming an epidemic. And so when I now see an epidemic taking place in my congressional district, in your congressional district, through New Jersey, through Connecticut, if you talk to Senator Dodd, he will tell you, through Connecticut, through Massachusetts, all up and down the East Coast, it is time to deal something. And so I think it is time to deal with it. And I see the gentleman from New Jersey here. You have blocked this bill for a long period of time. And I will tell you, I will not permit you to block it. And next year, I will offer amendment after amendment after amendment and do whatever I can to make sure the people that are impacted by this, to make sure that people who do not even know what may very well be threatening them will not be threatened. And I urge the gentleman from New Jersey, I yield to him, to also make some comments about this.
Thank you for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank Mr. Wolf for raising this. I didn't know he was going to be doing it. Just saw it on the television.
I didn't know I was going to be doing it until I saw the gentleman, Mr. Pallone, standing up and taking these up under suspensions.
So I appreciate the gentleman yielding. Let me just say, to clarify the record, this legislation, which would seek to get and lay bare the science about Lyme disease, the fact that I believe we do have an epidemic, the fact that it often goes misdiagnosed, underdiagnosed. It is called the Great Pretender because so many people have it and don't know it. It often masquerades as other kinds of anomalies manifesting in a person's body, and it's not until it gets to a chronic state, very often causing severe disability, including neurological damage, that people finally realize that they have Lyme disease. There's been, unfortunately, a significant, and I believe it's a cover-up, of the fact that chronic Lyme exists. The gentleman knows it. We have asked him repeatedly, the gentleman from New Jersey, my good friend, Mr. Pallone. This legislation has been pending in his subcommittee. He told Pat Smith, no relation to me, let me finish, who runs a Lyme disease organization, that this would get a hearing and would be marked up. It has not been marked up. And meanwhile, this epidemic is growing. Now, let me just say, for the enlightenment of my colleagues, the Infectious Disease Society of America, which creates and often does a very laudable job, the definitions, the parameters of what constitutes a certain disease, has looked at Lyme and said that chronic Lyme does not exist. Unfortunately, many of us have raised serious concerns about that because of what we believe to be conflicts of interest on the part of the panel members that made up of that panel. Chris Dodd is the prime sponsor of the legislation that I've introduced on the House side. We worked cooperatively on the legislation, so we have a companion bill on the Senate side. The legislation has over 110, I think it's 112 co-sponsors, totally bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans alike, rallying around this legislation. The problem with the Infectious Disease Society of America is that these conflicts of interest, we believe, has crowded out or caused them to come to a conclusion that chronic Lyme doesn't exist. We don't know absolutely if that's the truth, but Attorney General Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut finally took a look at this and came back with a scathing, insightful report that there were conflicts of interest. The red flag should go up everywhere. What does my legislation do? As Mr. Pallone knows, the legislation does not prescribe a protocol as he has suggested. It simply calls for an advisory committee that would take a good, long look at Lyme disease and to determine what is fact and fiction, and finally, for the sake of all of those who are suffering immensely from this disease and their families, say what we need to be doing to mitigate and hopefully stop the spread of Lyme. Whether it be long-term and very heavy antibiotic treatment, which I believe probably is the case based on clinical practitioners who have suggested that to be the case, but we want an honest look. As Mr. Pallone knows, we did not get an honest look from the Infectious Disease Society of America, and I find that appalling. Conflicts of interest with the insurance companies has no place in modern medicine. And regrettably, and it's been, again, the full weight of the Attorney General's report clearly suggests, Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, that there were significant conflicts of interest on the part of the panel members. Our legislation says, let's go where the science takes us. If the science says chronic Lyme exists, then all those patients and the insurance companies which need to be providing the wherewithal to get the coverage, to get the intervening medicines and the like the antibiotics. Because what has happened, as my friend knows, because of this exclusion of chronic Lyme as a problem in the definition, the insurance companies say, we don't have to pay. So when a patient presents with a bill of $100,000 or some excessive amount of money, the insurance companies say, not us, we're not going to pay for it. And they go right back to what I believe to be a false definition that precludes chronic Lyme as a condition. Now, you might think that chronic Lyme doesn't exist, I say to my friend, the chairman. But let's go where the science takes us. We need this advisory committee, and we need it now. All points of view, as our legislation clearly suggests, has to be a part of this group. We want a robust debate, not something that is engineered by the insurance companies. Finally, the legislation would authorize $100 million over 5 years, $20 million each year. Frankly, if that drops off, it's only an authorization. I'd like to see it go forward. We're not spending enough on Lyme. And it is, as Mr. Wolf said so aptly, it is growing exponentially. CDC admits we're missing most of the cases on Lyme. Maybe as many as 90% of the cases go unreported. Our state, Mr. Pallone, as you know, is number 3, according to CDC numbers, and they are probably very much understated in terms of the prevalence of Lyme disease. So I would make the appeal again, as I have made to my friend from New Jersey, as I've made to Mr. Dingell, as I've made to Mr. Barton, and everyone else. This legislation ought to be on this floor. It ought to be on the floor today. It is truly bipartisan. There ought to be a consensus to go where the science takes us. And again, an advisory committee, a blue ribbon panel that would be configured under this legislation would finally end, hopefully, this contentious debate and tell us what it is and what it is not. And let me also say, too, I have known dozens of people who have had chronic Lyme. Now, you might say it doesn't exist. Infectious Disease Society says that it doesn't exist. They've got the spirochete. They have been ruled in terms of having this very, very dangerous disease. And they have suffered neurological damage, severe joint damage, and many, many other problems. There's a new book called Cure Unknown that I would recommend to the body. I read it in one sitting because it is so incisive in finally breaking through the fog on this disease. People are walking around with Lyme and they don't even know it. We need to bring the forces to bear of the U.S. government that an advisory committee of this kind would do, a blue ribbon panel, a 9/11 type panel of scientists, of the best people we can put together to say, put aside the egregiously flawed Infectious Disease Society of America's finding, which Blumenthal, and I urge members to read Blumenthal's, and I'll put it in the record so members can read it. His findings were atrocious. Conflicts of interest everywhere. This legislation ought to be on the floor. It ought to be on the floor today.
Reclaiming my time, and I thank the gentleman.
All time for the gentleman from Oklahoma has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey has 16 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. First of all, I want to say to the gentleman from New Jersey, he's made a lot of statements about my views on this subject, which are simply not true, and I do not appreciate them. Now, I do have no intention, Mr. Speaker.
You may or may not.
I have no intention, Mr. Speaker, of yielding to the gentleman.
Controls the time.
I have no intention of yielding to the gentleman because of the disrespect that he has shown. Now, secondly, let me also say this. I do appreciate the fact that the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, has on several occasions come up to me in the last few months and talked to me about this legislation, and we've had very reasoned conversations about the legislation. But I will also point out that the gentleman from New Jersey has not. The gentleman from New Jersey has not spoken to me at all about this legislation, and certainly not in my recollection in the last year. So if he felt it was so important the way the gentleman from Virginia did and has, he certainly had many opportunities to come up to me and talk to me about it. He has not. And I see the gentleman from New Jersey all the time, on the floor, at home, on various occasions. He has not spoken to me. So I want to thank the gentleman from Virginia for at least saying that he has taken the time, had some reasoned discussions about it. That is not true of my colleague from New Jersey, which is why I deeply resent the fact that he's on the floor here today talking about it, because it's the first time I recollect him ever talking to me about it. Now, let me say a few other things. First of all, as far as the science is concerned, the science is in the Infectious Disease Society and the CDC, not with the Attorney General and some political grandstanding that he's doing in Connecticut, nor with my colleague from New Jersey who's grandstanding here today. I am very concerned about Lyme disease. I've been working with the CDC to address the issue. We're awaiting answers from the agency on how best to address this. I have, in fact, talked to many of my constituents about this, even though my own colleague hasn't talked to me about it from New Jersey. And I also would like to say this. As far as the Infectious Disease Association, they basically are the majority opinion. Many doctors, including my neighbors who are physicians in my hometown, very much agree with the Infectious Disease Society and don't think that this should be treated with these antibiotics for a long period of time because they're concerned about the impact on people and whether they would be seriously injured or even die from the antibiotics. There's a lot of controversy that involves this issue. It's very involved and it's very controversial. It shouldn't be considered today on a consent calendar. And that was the only point I was trying to make to my colleague from Virginia, that we need to have hearings, and we will have hearings on the issue in general, and we could include this bill as part of that in the next session. But to bring this up today on the consent calendar, when they know very well that there's not agreement on this and we couldn't possibly get a UC or have this on the suspension calendar, it's really very upsetting, and particularly coming from my colleague from New Jersey, who has never talked to me about this at all. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlemen, to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman.
Time, if you don't mind.
Well,
Do you have other speakers?
we might, but I yield such time to the Speaker from New Jersey to address another concern.
Thank you. I do rise in strong support of S 906, the Mercury Market Minimization Act of 2007, Mr. Speaker. I didn't get a chance when Mr. Pallone was here to correct the record. We did contact Congressman Frank Pallone and Nathan Deal by way of letter on May 18, 2007, and wrote at the time, as co-chairs of the Congressional Lyme Disease Caucus, we are writing to respectfully request that you mark up and report H.R. 741. H.R. 741, the Lyme Disease, Tick-Borne Disease Prevention, Education, and Research Act of 07, would work towards the goals of prevention, accurate diagnosis, and effective treatment of Lyme. Then we went on to explain the bill. We pointed out that at the time we had 77 co-sponsors. That's now over 112, and it is totally bipartisan. We also pointed out significantly that Lyme is the most prevalent vector-borne disease in the United States today. More than 220,000 Americans develop Lyme each year. And that's, according to CDC, that's only 10% of the cases that meet its surveillance criteria are reported. Cases that fall outside of the surveillance criteria are not even considered anywhere statistically. If not diagnosed and treated early, Lyme disease can lead to chronic illness and can affect every system in the body, including the central nervous system and cardiac systems. Later symptoms of Lyme disease include arthritis, neurological problems such as facial paralysis, memory problems, extreme weaknesses of the extremities, seizures, heart block, and inflammation, and even blindness. And on a second point, so we sent that back in May 18, 2007, and I say that with respect to my colleague. Let me also point out, and I just will read a very small portion of Attorney General Richard Blumenthal, the Attorney General of Connecticut. And this is his statement. Attorney General Blumenthal today announced, and this is May 1st, 2008, that his antitrust investigation has uncovered serious flaws in the Infectious Disease Society of America's process in writing its 2006 Lyme disease guidelines, and the IDSA has agreed to reassess them with the assistance of an outside arbiter, and that has gone very, very slow. The IDSA guidelines have sweeping, this is Blumenthal speaking, have sweeping and significant impacts on Lyme disease medical care. They are commonly applied by insurance companies in restricting coverage for long-term antibiotic treatment or other medical care, and are also strongly influence treatment decisions by physicians. Insurance companies have denied coverage for long-term antibiotic treatment, relying on those guidelines as justification. The guidelines are also widely cited for conclusions that chronic Lyme disease is non-existent. Blumenthal goes on to say, this agreement vindicates my investigation, finding undisclosed financial interests and forcing a reassessment of IDSA's guidelines. Blumenthal said, and I quote, "My office uncovered undisclosed financial interests held by several of the most powerful IDSA panelists. The IDSA's guideline panel improperly ignored or minimized consideration of alternative medical opinion and evidence regarding chronic Lyme disease, potentially raising serious questions about whether the recommendations reflected all relevant science. The IDSA's Lyme disease guideline process lacked important procedural safeguards, requiring complete reevaluation of its 06 Lyme disease guidelines. In effect, a comprehensive reassessment through a new panel. Blumenthal, and I will put this in the record, talks about the conflicts of interest with the insurance companies. And again, I would think this Congress would want to get to the science. Find out, does chronic Lyme exist, and whether or not this cover-up is indeed a cover-up. Yield back, and I thank my friend for yielding.